The night this happened, I was beyond tired. My daughter had been up all night with an ear infection, and I'd spent the whole day trying to get her to a clinic and then back home. I hadn't slept in maybe 24 hours when I clocked in at 10 p.m. I remember walking through the employee entrance near the old Macy's, and the air just felt heavy. My head was foggy, and my feet already hurt before I even started my first round. Um, by 2 a.m., I was hitting a wall. The mall was pitch black, except for the emergency lights that cast these long, weird orange shadows across the corridors. I was supposed to be doing my second walkthrough of the upper level near the food court, but I couldn't keep my eyes open. Every time I blinked, my eyelids stayed shut just a little bit longer. I told myself I'd just sit down for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes to rest my eyes and clear the fog. There was a little alcove near the back of a shuttered Gap store, right where the hallway narrows toward the service elevators. It was out of view of the few working cameras we had left in that wing. Um, I sat down on one of those hard wooden benches they have for shoppers, leaned my head back against the cold glass of the storefront, and I was out before I even realized I'd closed my eyes. I don't know how long I was out. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The thing that woke me up wasn't a voice or a footstep. It was a sound that didn't belong in a quiet mall. It was a loud, metallic clack crash, followed by the heavy thud of something soft hitting the floor. I bolted upright. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I was going to have a heart attack right there. For a second, I didn't even know where I was. Then the smell of the mall, that weird mix of floor wax and old popcorn, hit me, and I remembered. I looked at my watch. 2:38 a.m. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. My flashlight was still clipped to my belt. I didn't turn it on yet. I just stood there in the dark, listening. The sound had come from the department store area just around the corner, a place called Belk that had closed down months ago. The gates were supposed to be locked, but sometimes the kids from the neighborhood find ways in through the roof vents or the loading docks. Then I heard it again. A sliding sound, like someone was dragging a heavy bag over the floor. I pulled my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the dark, hitting the dusty floor and the empty storefronts. I walked toward the noise, trying to keep my footsteps quiet, but my boots kept squeaking on the tile. I hated that sound. It felt like I was announcing exactly where I was to whoever was in there. I rounded the corner near the old fountain, the one they turned off years ago that's now just a dry concrete pit, and my light hit a rack of clothes. Except it wasn't standing up. It was a heavy, circular metal rack, the kind they use for winter coats. It was lying on its side in the middle of the concourse. Dozens of old, leftover jackets were scattered across the floor like bodies. That rack hadn't just fallen. It was heavy. It would have taken a lot of force to knock that thing over. I scanned the area with my light. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and shaky. I hated that I sounded scared, but I was. The mall felt way too big in that moment, and I felt way too small. I saw it then, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. A shadow. It wasn't like a shadow you see on the wall. It was a shape. It was dark, darker than the rest of the room, and it was standing perfectly still behind a mannequin display near the entrance of the Belk. It was tall, taller than a normal person, or maybe it was just the way it was hunched over. It didn't have a face, or at least I couldn't see one in the quick second my light brushed over it. The second the light hit it, the shape moved. It didn't run like a person runs. It didn't make any noise. It just darted. It was fast, unnervingly fast. It ducked behind the corner of the store entrance and disappeared into the darkness of the empty department store. "Hey, stop!" I yelled. I don't know why I yelled it. It's just what you're supposed to do. I started running. My adrenaline was pumping now, clearing out all the exhaustion. I reached the spot where I'd seen the shape and swung my light into the Belk store. The store was a wreck. Racks were overturned everywhere. Mannequins were stripped naked and tossed in piles. It looked like someone had been living in there, or maybe just destroying it for fun. I followed the sound of footsteps, fast light tapping on the linoleum, deeper into the back of the store toward the fitting rooms. I was breathing hard now. The air in the store was stale and hot. "I'm calling the cops," I lied. My radio was back on the bench where I'd fallen asleep. I'd forgotten to grab it in my panic. I chased the sound through the maze of empty shelves. I thought I saw the shadow again, darting through a doorway that led to the loading docks. I pushed through the heavy swinging doors, expecting to find someone struggling with the exit lock. But the room was empty. The loading dock was a big concrete square. The rolling metal doors were all shut and padlocked from the inside. There was nowhere for anyone to go unless they went up the narrow metal stairs to the mezzanine office, but the door at the top was welded shut. I stood there, panting, sweeping my light around the room. There was nothing, just some old shipping pallets and a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. I waited for a minute, maybe two. I didn't hear anything else. No breathing, no sliding, no tapping, just the silence of the mall. I felt like an idiot. I figured maybe it was just a stray dog or some kid who knew the layout better than I did and had doubled back around me in the dark. I started to walk back toward the main mall area, my heart finally starting to slow down. I was already thinking about how I was going to explain the fallen rack to my supervisor without admitting I'd been asleep. I got back to the spot where the coat rack was lying on the floor. I stopped to look at it, thinking maybe I should try to stand it back up. That's when I saw it. Right where I had been sitting, on the floor exactly in front of the bench where I'd fallen asleep, was something shiny. I walked over and shined my light on the floor. It was a knife, but not just a pocket knife or a box cutter. It was a massive, old-fashioned kitchen knife. The blade was maybe 10 inches long. The wooden handle was worn down and stained dark, like it had been handled for years. It was sitting right there, dead center on the tile, pointed directly at the bench. My blood went cold. I actually felt a chill crawl up my spine. I looked back at the bench. If I had been sitting there, my legs would have been right where that knife was lying. I realized then that the sound, the crashing of the coat rack, hadn't been an accident. Someone hadn't just bumped into it. They had knocked it over on purpose. They had knocked it over to wake me up. I looked around the dark mall, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. That shadow hadn't been running away from me because it was scared. It had been leading me away. It wanted me to chase it. I started thinking about those 20 minutes I was asleep. I was sitting there, completely defenseless, my head back, my neck exposed. Someone had been standing there. They had been standing right over me, holding that huge, heavy knife. They could have done it whenever they wanted. They could have ended me right there on that bench, and nobody would have found me until the morning shift came in at 7 a.m. But they didn't. They waited for me to wake up. They wanted me to see them. Or they wanted to see the look on my face when I found what they left behind. I didn't stay to find the shadow again. I didn't even go back for my radio. I turned and ran. I didn't care how much noise I made. I ran all the way back to the security office on the other side of the mall, locked the door, and sat there with my back against the wall until the sun came up. I never went back to that wing of the mall alone. I quit a week later. I think about that guy, or whatever it was, standing over me in the dark. I think about why he chose to knock over that rack instead of just using the knife while I was dreaming. I think he wanted me to know. He wanted me to spend the rest of my life knowing that he could have, but he chose not to. I never really talked about this to anyone except my wife, and even then, I kept the details pretty vague. I'm not a writer. I'm just a normal guy. My name is Lucas. I work in logistics now, driving a forklift for a warehouse out in Dayton, but a few years ago, I was doing private security. To be honest, I only took the security job because the pay was decent for sitting on my ass most of the night, and I needed something steady while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. The company I worked for contracted out guards to various properties around Ohio, office buildings, construction sites, that kind of thing. About 6 months into the job, I got assigned to the night shift at Forest Fair Village. If you know anything about Cincinnati or the surrounding areas, you probably know Forest Fair. It was one of those massive, sprawling shopping malls built in the late 80s or early 90s. It was supposed to be this huge entertainment complex. Over the years, it just died. Store by store, people stopped coming. By the time I got assigned there, it was basically a massive, empty concrete tomb. There was maybe one arcade still operating near the main entrance, a couple of weird local shops, and a gym. The rest of the place, millions of square feet of it, was completely dead. My shift was 4 p.m. to midnight. The mall technically closed its doors to the public at 8 p.m., but the gym stayed open later, and we had to stick around to do interior patrols, make sure no kids were hiding in the abandoned food courts, and lock up the perimeter. The job was incredibly boring. Most nights it was just me and an older guy named Gary. Gary was the shift supervisor, but he mostly just sat in the security office near the loading docks, watching old movies on a portable DVD player. That left me to do the walking, and walking in a dead mall at night is an experience I don't recommend. Uh, the lighting was terrible because the property management company was cheap and only kept about a third of the fluorescent lights on. You'd be walking down these wide corridors with empty storefronts on either side, and your footsteps would echo for miles. Sometimes the old escalators would make this groaning metal sound even though they were turned off. It was creepy, but you get used to it. You tell yourself it's just an old building settling. The worst part of the shift wasn't the patrols, though. It was the locker room. Our company had a strict policy about the uniforms. We had these heavy, dark blue shirts with the company patches, a heavy-duty belt, and black tactical pants. The company didn't want us wearing the uniform off property. They said it was a liability issue. Like if we stopped at a gas station on the way home and someone thought we were cops and started trouble. So we had to change into our uniforms when we got there and change back into our street clothes before we clocked out. The security office was too small to change in, especially with Gary sitting right there. So we used the old maintenance locker room. It was located down a long, narrow service hallway behind the abandoned food court. To get there, you had to walk past the old kitchens where they used to make Chinese food and pizza. The whole hallway smelled like ancient grease and floor wax. The locker room itself was windowless. It had ugly yellow cinder block walls and a concrete floor painted gray. There was a row of rusty lockers, a sink with a dripping faucet, and 3 changing cubicles at the very back. They were just regular bathroom stalls, really, but with benches inside instead of toilets. They had those metal doors that don't quite reach the floor, leaving about a foot of space at the bottom. The lighting in there was always buzzing. It was just an unpleasant, cold place. I want to make it clear that I'm not a guy who believes in ghosts or the paranormal. I don't watch scary movies. I like sports. I like working on cars. If something weird happens, my brain automatically goes to the most logical explanation. Rats, wind, water pipes. That's just how I am built. Which is why it took me 4 days to realize how much danger I might have been in. Day 1, it was a Tuesday. The shift was normal, completely uneventful. I walked my miles, checked the exit doors, told a couple of teenagers who were skateboarding near the back entrance to go home. By 11:45 p.m., I was exhausted. My feet hurt from my boots, and I was sweating under that thick polyester shirt. I radioed Gary and told him I was heading to change. He just grunted over the radio. I walked down the long hallway behind the food court. The lights in the hallway were off, so I had to use my flashlight until I got to the locker room door. I pushed it open, and the fluorescent lights hummed loudly. The smell of old grease hit me like a wall. I walked to the back, to the changing cubicles. I always used the one on the far right against the wall. I went in, locked the little metal latch, and sat down on the wooden bench to untie my boots. The locker room was completely silent except for the dripping sink and the hum of the lights. It's the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I got my boots off and was unbuckling my heavy belt when I heard it. It was coming from the cubicle right next to mine. The middle one. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a slow, deliberate sound. It sounded exactly like someone dragging their fingernails down the painted metal partition that separated my cubicle from the middle one. I stopped unbuckling my belt. I just sat there, holding my breath, listening. Scratch, scratch. My first thought was that it was mice. The mall was infested with them. Sometimes they'd get inside the walls or run across the ceiling tiles. But this didn't sound like a mouse. It sounded too heavy, too intentional. Gary? I called out. I thought maybe the old man had come back to use the bathroom or something and was messing with me. No answer. Just the buzzing of the lights. I looked down at the gap at the bottom of the partition. Because of the angle I was sitting, I couldn't see the floor of the middle cubicle clearly, just the shadow of it. I didn't see any boots or shoes. I convinced myself it was just a rat scratching at something, or maybe the building settling and the metal flexing. I stood up, quickly pulled my uniform shirt off, threw on my regular t-shirt, and grabbed my bag. I didn't even bother folding the uniform. I just stuffed it in my locker. As I walked out of the locker room, I didn't hear the scratching anymore. I clocked out, got in my car, and drove home. By the time I woke up the next day, I had convinced myself it was nothing, just old building noises. Day 2 Wednesday. The shift dragged on forever. It was raining outside, which meant the mall was even emptier than usual. The roof leaked in a few places, so I spent a good hour putting down yellow, wet floor signs and plastic buckets near the old Sears entrance. The dripping water echoed all over the empty wing. I brought a thermos of coffee to keep myself awake. Gary was in a bad mood because his portable DVD player broke, so he barely talked to me all night. I did my patrols trying to keep my mind busy. I didn't think about the locker room at all. It honestly hadn't registered as a threat in my mind. Midnight rolled around. Same routine. Radio Gary, walk down the dark hallway behind the food court, push open the heavy locker room door. I went straight to my usual cubicle on the right. I locked the door and sat down with a heavy sigh. I was tired. I unlaced my left boot, then my right. I took off my socks because they were wet from walking near the roof leaks. Then I heard the voice. It was coming from the middle cubicle again, right on the other side of the thin metal wall. It was a voice, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. It sounded like someone mumbling, but it was wet. That's the only way I can describe it, like someone trying to talk while their mouth was completely full of water. The words were slurred, gurgling, and very fast. Mumble, grumble, belch, war. It was a low pitch. It didn't sound like a man or a woman, just a voice. I froze. I was half undressed, holding my wet socks. My heart did a weird jump in my chest. "Hello?" I said. My voice sounded loud and cracked a little bit. The mumbling stopped instantly. Dead silence. I waited. Nothing. I looked down at the gap at the bottom of the partition. Again, I couldn't see any shoes, just the dirty gray concrete floor and the shadows. "Hey, who's in there?" I asked. I tried to sound authoritative, like a security guard should. Nothing, not even the sound of breathing. My mind started racing, trying to find the logical explanation. The mall had a homeless problem sometimes. People would sneak in through the loading dock doors when the delivery trucks came and try to find an empty service closet to sleep in. We caught them every now and then. Maybe a homeless person had wandered into the locker room while I was on patrol. But why would they be sitting in the dark in a changing cubicle, mumbling to themselves? And how did they get past Gary in the office? I stood up slowly. I grabbed my pants and pulled them on. I didn't bother changing my shirt this time. I was just wearing my uniform shirt and my street pants. I grabbed my boots and carried them. I unlocked my cubicle door and stepped out. I turned to look at the middle cubicle. The door was closed. I thought about pushing it open or looking under. I really did. But something in my gut told me not to. It wasn't logic anymore. It was instinct. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you just know someone else is in there, even if you can't see them? It was like that, but multiplied by 100. The air around that middle stall felt heavy. It smelled worse than the usual grease, too. It smelled sour like old milk and wet dirt. I backed away toward the exit. "I'm locking up," I said loudly to the closed door. "You need to clear out." I didn't wait for an answer. I walked out of the locker room, put my boots on in the hallway, and left. I didn't tell Gary. I felt stupid. I was a grown man, a security guard, running away from a mumbling sound in a bathroom stall. I figured if it was a homeless person, they'd be gone by tomorrow. I just wanted to go home and sleep. Day 3 Thursday, I woke up with a headache. I really didn't want to go to work. I thought about calling in sick, but I needed the hours. The rent was due next week. When I got to the mall at 4 p.m., I immediately checked the locker room. I turned on all the lights. I walked back to the cubicles. The doors were all wide open. Nobody was there. I checked the lockers, under the benches. Nothing. No trash, no blankets, no sign that anyone had been sleeping there. I felt a wave of relief. See, I told myself. It was just some transient guy who wandered in and left before morning. Nothing to worry about. The shift was completely normal. I even felt good about it. I joked around with Gary for a bit. We watched part of a baseball game on a small TV he brought to replace his DVD player. I did my patrols with a bit more energy. I checked all the exterior doors twice to make sure nobody could sneak in. I was feeling confident. Then 11:45 p.m. hit. The mall was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy on your eardrums. I walked down the dark hallway behind the food court. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I was definitely on edge. I kept my hand on my heavy Maglite flashlight as I pushed open the locker room door. Empty, bright, buzzing, empty. I walked to the far right cubicle. I went in, locked the door. I started changing fast. I wanted to be in and out in 2 minutes. Boots off, belt off, uniform shirt off. I was pulling my t-shirt over my head when I heard it. It wasn't scratching this time. It wasn't the wet mumbling. It was crying from the middle cubicle. It started low, just a soft whimpering. Then it turned into a slow, ragged sobbing. It sounded incredibly pathetic and sad. Who. It sounded like a grown man trying to keep his crying quiet but failing. I stopped moving. My t-shirt was halfway down my torso. I just stood there, staring at the painted metal wall separating us. Gary? I asked softly. The crying didn't stop. It just kept going, slow and rhythmic. I thought about the maintenance crew. There was an older guy named Dave who worked the day shift, but sometimes he stayed late to fix things. Dave was going through a really bad time. I knew his wife had kicked him out a few weeks ago and he was living in an extended stay motel. Sometimes guys just break down. Sometimes you just have to hide in a bathroom and let it out. Hey, I said, keeping my voice gentle. Dave, is that you, man? The crying hitched. It stopped for a second, then started again. It sounded wetter now, more guttural. Hey, buddy, it's Lucas, I said. You all right in there? You need a minute? I waited for a response. I expected a sniffle, yeah, I'm fine, just give me a minute. Instead, the crying stopped completely, but it wasn't a natural stop. It didn't taper off. It just cut off abruptly like someone had flipped a switch, and then the silence came back. But this silence was wrong. Before, I couldn't hear breathing. Now, I could hear breathing. It wasn't human breathing. It was a slow, raspy inhalation that seemed to go on for entirely too long, followed by a heavy, wet exhale. It sounded like a large animal with fluid in its lungs. Every hair arm stood up. My flight response kicked in hard. I didn't care if it was Dave. I didn't care if it was a homeless guy. I knew, standing there, that whatever was on the other side of that thin metal wall was not okay. I shoved my arms through my t-shirt sleeves. I grabbed my boots, didn't put them on, just carried them. I unlocked my door as quietly as I could. It made a loud click that echoed in the room. The heavy, raspy breathing in the next stall stopped. I shoved the door open, stepped out, and practically ran to the exit. I didn't look back at the middle cubicle. I pushed through the heavy wooden door into the dark hallway and ran all the way to the security office in my socks. Gary looked at me like I was crazy. Where are your boots, kid? He asked. I'm going home, I said. I was shaking. I'll see you tomorrow. I got in my car and locked the doors. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, just trying to get my heart rate down. I tried to apply logic. I tried to tell myself it was Dave. He was sick, he had a cold, he was embarrassed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't Dave. Day 4, Friday. I spent the entire day dreading work. I felt a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I couldn't eat. I just sat on my couch watching TV without really seeing it. I decided I was going to quit. I couldn't do the locker room anymore. But I'm not the kind of guy who just ghosts a job. I was raised to give notice, to be professional. Plus, I needed the paycheck for that week. I decided I would go in, do my shift, and tell Gary it was my last night. And I decided, no matter what, I wasn't going to use the locker room to change. I'd wear my uniform home and take the hit from the company if they found out. I got to work. I told Gary I was putting in my 2 weeks. He just shrugged and said, "Suit yourself." The shift was pure agony. Every time I walked past the dark hallway leading to the locker room, I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. I stayed as far away from the abandoned food court as possible. I walked the upper level mostly, looking down at the empty kiosks and dead fountains. Finally, 11:50 p.m. Almost time to go. I went to the security office. Gary was packing up his bag. "You gotta leave your radio and keys in your locker, Lucas," Gary said, not looking up. "Company policy. Boss does inventory on Saturdays. My heart sank. He was right. We had strict orders to lock our equipment in the maintenance lockers. If I took the radio and the master keys home, I could get charged with theft. The boss was a hard ass about equipment. I had to go into the locker room. Right, I mumbled. I grabbed my bag. I walked down the hallway. It felt 10 times longer than usual. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. I pushed the door open. The lights buzzed. The smell of sour milk and wet dirt was overpowering tonight. It made my stomach heave. I didn't go to the cubicles. I walked straight to my metal locker, which was near the door. I unlocked it, threw my radio inside, and tossed the ring of master keys on the shelf. I was moving as fast as I possibly could. I slammed the locker door shut. The metallic bang echoed loudly, and then I heard a sound from the back of the room, from the cubicles. It was the bench creaking, like someone shifting their weight on the wood. I froze. I was standing by the lockers, about 20 feet away from the cubicles. I looked towards the back. The door to the middle cubicle was closed. I should have just walked out. I should have turned around, walked out the door, and never come back. I had my keys locked up. I was done. But anger suddenly mixed with my fear. I was tired of being scared in my own workplace. I was a 25-year-old man, a security guard. I let some weird transient guy push me out of a locker room for 3 days. The streak of unusual happenings, the scratching, the mumbling, the crying, it made me angry. I wanted to know what I was running from. I wanted to see the face of the guy who was doing this so I could call the cops and have him trespassed. I dropped my bag. I started walking slowly toward the cubicles. "Hey," I said loudly. "I know you're in there. I'm calling the police right now. You're trespassing on private property." Silence. No breathing, no scratching, no crying. I got closer. 10 feet. 5 feet. I stopped right in front of the middle cubicle. The smell was atrocious. It smelled like a dead animal mixed with swamp water. I put my hand on my heavy flashlight, ready to pull it out. "Come out," I demanded. My voice shook, ruining the tough guy act. Nothing. I didn't want to open the door. I was too afraid of what I would see standing there. So, driven by some morbid, stupid curiosity, I decided to look under. I just wanted to see shoes. If I saw sneakers or boots, I'd know it was just a guy. I took a step back, bent my knees, and crouched down, lowering my head toward the dirty concrete floor to look through the 1-foot gap beneath the metal door. I expected to see work boots, or maybe dirty bare feet of a homeless man. I saw a foot, but it wasn't normal. It was planted flat on the concrete, right near the edge of the door. The skin was a sickly, pale gray color, almost translucent, but it was caked in black, greasy dirt. The toes were unnaturally long, and the nails were thick, yellow, and jagged, like they had been broken off rather than cut. It was barefoot. There was no shoe, no sock. But that wasn't what made my throat close up. That wasn't what made me want to vomit. As I stared at that gray, filthy foot, something fell from above. It landed on the concrete floor right next to the foot. It was a clump of hair. Long, stringy, jet black hair. It looked wet. Then another clump fell. It hit the floor softly. Then another. The person, or whatever it was, inside the stall was losing hair in large, wet clumps. And as I stared, paralyzed by complete and utter terror, the gray foot slowly pivoted. The heel scraped against the concrete. The toes pointed directly toward me, toward the gap. The knees began to bend. It was lowering itself to look back at me under the door. I didn't wait to see the face. The primal, animal part of my brain took over completely. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. I scrambled backward on my hands and feet like a crab, scrambling frantically away from the stall. I hit my back against the metal lockers, scrambled to my feet, grabbed my bag, and ran. I burst through the locker room door, hitting it so hard with my shoulder that I bruised it. I ran down the dark hallway, past the abandoned food court, my boots pounding loudly against the floor tiles. I ran past the security office. Gary wasn't there. He must have already gone to his car. I didn't stop running until I burst out the glass doors into the humid night air. I sprinted across the empty parking lot to my Honda. I unlocked it, threw myself inside, and slammed the door. I drove all the way home in my full uniform. I didn't care about the policy. I didn't care about the job. I was hyperventilating the entire drive, constantly checking my rearview mirror, terrified that I was going to see something with long, wet hair sitting in my back seat. The next morning, I called the branch manager of the security company. I didn't tell him about the foot or the hair or the crying. He would have thought I was on drugs. I just told him that a vagrant had snuck into the locker room, that the mall was unsafe, and that I flat out refused to go back to Forest Fair Village. I told him I'd quit immediately if he made me go back. The manager was annoyed, but they were short-staffed. He told me he'd reassign me. Luckily, he moved me to a daytime post at a corporate office building in downtown Cincinnati. Whatever it wasn't just some guy looking for a place to sleep. It was something else, something that belonged in the dark, dead parts of that mall. And I thank God every single day that I ran before it bent down far enough to look me in the eye. The shift at Parque Arauco in Santiago usually isn't bad. It's a massive place, lots of glass, high-end shops, and that cold mountain air that creeps in from the Andes once the sun goes down. My name is Mateo. Mateo. I've been working security here for about 2 years. It's a boring job, which is exactly why I took it. You walk, you check locks, you drink bad coffee, and you wait for the sun to come up so you can go home and sleep. But 3 weeks ago, something changed. I don't know how to explain it without sounding like I've lost my mind, but I'm writing this down because I haven't slept more than 2 hours a night since it happened. The first signs. It started on a Tuesday. The mall closes at 8:30 p.m., and by 10 p.m., even the janitors are mostly gone from the luxury wing. I was doing my rounds near the Falabella department store. Everything was quiet, just the hum of the HVAC system and the occasional squeak of my boots on the polished marble. I walked past a boutique called Rhapsodia. They have these tall, thin mannequins with no faces, just smooth plastic heads. I looked in the window as I passed. There were 3 of them in the center display. When I came back around 20 minutes later, there were 4. I stopped. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was just tired. I counted them again. 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4th one was tucked slightly behind the others, wearing a long floral dress. I figured a window dresser had stayed late, and I just missed them. I checked the door, locked. I checked the back corridor, empty. I told myself I just wasn't paying attention the first time. That's how the brain works, right? It fills in the gaps. The 3rd floor incident. 2 nights later, I was on the 3rd floor. This area is always creepier because the skylights let in the moonlight, making everything look gray and washed out. I was walking toward the food court when I heard a heavy thud. It sounded like someone had dropped a sack of flour. It came from inside a bridal shop. I shone my flashlight through the glass. A mannequin in a white wedding gown was lying face down on the carpet. It hadn't just tipped over, it was 3 meters away from the platform where it belonged. Great, I muttered. I figured the vibrations from the heavy ventilation fans had shaken it off. But as I watched, I noticed the arms. Mannequins have stiff joints. When they fall, they usually stay in whatever pose they were set in. This one had its arms tucked under its chest like it had tried to break its fall. I didn't open the store. I just kept walking. My heart was thumping a bit faster, but I kept telling myself it was just gravity, just physics. The woman in white. The night that broke me was a Friday. The mall felt different that night, heavy, like the air was thick. I was checking the north wing near the luxury watch stores. I turned to the corner near a high-end clothing store called Castañer. The security lights were dimmed to save power, so most of the store was in deep shadow. In the very back of the store, sitting on a velvet bench, was a woman. She was wearing a white dress, not a wedding dress, just a plain, long white summer dress. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her light, right next to 2 standing mannequins. My first thought was, how did she get in? My second thought was, why isn't she moving? Hola, I called out, tapping on the glass with my heavy ring. Senora, the mall is closed. You need to come to the door. She didn't move. She didn't even twitch. I thought maybe she was a prankster, or maybe someone who had a medical emergency and just froze up. I pulled my keys out, my hands shaking. I unlocked the side gate and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't a rot smell. It smelled like old dust and cold plastic. Miss? I said, walking closer. I kept my flashlight aimed at her feet because I was scared to look at her face. I got within 5 feet. I could see the texture of the dress. It looked cheap, like old linen. Her skin was the same color as the mannequins, a dull off-white. But she had hair. Real, thin, black hair that seemed to be rooted directly into her scalp in patches. Then she moved her head. It wasn't a human movement. It didn't have the fluid grace of a neck turning. It was a series of micro jerks, like a frame by frame animation. She looked up at me. She had no eyelids, just wide, dark eyes that looked like wet glass. I froze. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Are you... do you need help? I whispered. I don't know why I asked. I knew by then she wasn't a person. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up. As she rose, her limbs made a dry, cracking sound, the sound of plastic snapping or wood splintering. And then she reached out and shoved the two mannequins standing next to her. She didn't just push them. She slammed them down with a strength that didn't make sense. They shattered against the floor, heads rolling across the carpet. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and bolted. I didn't care about my job or the protocol. I ran out of that store, slammed the gate, and didn't stop until I was in the bright fluorescent light of the security office. The aftermath. I watched the monitors for the rest of the night. I kept the camera fixed on Castanier. I saw her. On the grainy black and white screen, she was standing in the middle of the store, surrounded by the broken pieces of the other mannequins. She stayed there for 3 hours, just staring at the camera. At 5:15 a.m., right before the morning cleaning crew arrived, she simply sat back down, and then she stopped moving. When the store manager opened up at 9 a.m., she called security to report vandalism. I went down there with my supervisor. The two mannequins were broken on the floor, but the woman in the white dress, she was gone. There was no third mannequin on that bench. There was no one in the store. We checked the security footage from the mall exits. No one had left that wing. No one had entered. On the footage, when the manager walked in, the spot where the woman had been sitting was just empty space. But I know what I saw. I have the footage saved on a thumb drive, even though I'm terrified to look at it. On the digital recording, you can see the mannequins fall over by themselves. You can see me talking to thin air. But in the reflection of the glass storefront, for just a second, you can see a white shape standing behind me. I quit the next day. I told them my mother was sick in Valparaiso and I had to leave. I don't think they believed me, but they didn't care. I'm staying at a small hostel now. Every time I pass a clothing store, I look the other way. I can't look at their faces. I'm always afraid that if I look too long, one of them will jerk its head toward me, and I'll hear that ch-ch-ch sound again. I don't think she was a ghost. I think she was something else, something that lives in the spaces we leave behind at night.